Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph. That's where we're at right now. And we're going to be there for some time. Because interestingly, the longest biographical narrative in the entire Torah is the story of Joseph's life. More psukim are spent telling us about his life development. Even Moshe Rabbi. I mean, Moshe, the Torah's his, right? He's speaking it, giving it his prophecy, but it's not a biographical narrative. We're looking at Joseph more than we look at anybody else. So I thought we would think on that a bit together. Be able to kind of have a sense of at least an aspect of why that is. Why does the Torah spend so much time on him and his development? It's a peculiar identity in the Torah. Because you have this individual, he's by far probably the youngest individual that we see in Torah up until this point. Everybody until now in Genesis is 900 some odd years old, and he's 17. Vehu nar, right? Ben Shvarzer Shana, he's 17 years old. We know that he's exceptionally good looking, which is not necessarily a plus for him. Just gets him into a bit of difficulty, right? We'll have to explore that a little bit more. But we also know that he is a dreamer, and that he seems to have no problems at all expressing these dreams in his family and to his brothers, and that also gets him into quite a bit of hot water, to the point that it says explicitly, that his brothers hate him, and they are jealous of him, to the point that they're ready to kill him, quite literally. So this is not a minor family, kerfuffle, right? This is not a minor family issue. This gets to be very, very serious. So Yosef has some very interesting aspects to him. He ends up growing up in Egypt. There's no Chabad in Egypt. The odds are not in his favor. We don't expect that he's going to be able to make it. His brothers don't expect that he will be able to make it. But of course, we know the end of the story, and so it's easy for us to read the story. But it is important for us to forget the end of the story when we're reading the story, because imagine if you were in his place. You're sold as a slave. How do you get out of that? I mean, how do you get out of that? It's doom. And the amazing thing is that this young man deals with his situations in remarkable ways. So we're going to just look at some of them. I'm conscious of time. We're going to, let's say, social contract is about 40 minutes, so then I'm happy to open for questions. Is that all right, or is that okay? If not, no. Yeah, you tell me if we need to go shorter.
No, that's great.
That's what I'm fine. Okay. So Yosef is sold as a slave. Imagine for a second you don't know the end of the story. You're him. What does he do? He gives everything that he's got to this job. He does it in the utmost faith. He's 17. To the point that it says that his master, Potiphar, gave him full authority over his entire household. Lo yadai tov me'uma, it says. He didn't pay attention to anything he was doing. Potiphar was off golfing. He said, Yosef, you take care of everything. That was it. He gave him his paycheck, whatever it was, which was the food, right? It was room and board. That's what he gave him. He's in jail. We're going to skip it for a second, right? He finds himself then in jail, right? So it's bad enough you're sold as a slave. Now you're in jail. Get out of that one. You don't know the end of the story. Be him. He becomes the best prisoner in jail. He is a faithful prisoner. And he is so faithful that the prison warden, who is in charge of the entire place, pays no attention to what he's doing. He puts him in charge. He's off golfing. He says, Yosef, you take care of everything, all is well. He becomes viceroy of Egypt. He is the best viceroy of Egypt. He does it with everything he's got. Paro goes golfing. He says, you take care of everything. So there's this interesting pattern in Yosef's life. And that wherever it is that he finds himself, he gives everything that he has to the thing that he is in now. And it shines, right? Everyone around him, especially his supervisors, see this very clearly. Paro sees it in a minute. I always said Paro was a phenomenal leader, my opinion. Why? Because he recognizes that this kid, who's now 30, when he stands in front of Paro, this kid has got what is necessary to be able to pull Egypt out of sudden doom. He believes the interpretation of the dreams that Yosef offers him. He doesn't like any of the other interpretations. He accepts this interpretation. He accepts that Egypt is going to plunge into 7 years of famine so bad that they will not remember the previous years of plenty, which is in itself highly odd. Because what happens when the going gets tough? You spend time nostalgic, remembering the good old days. It's going to be so consuming that nobody will remember the good old days. They will only get stuck in what is happening now. And what Paro realizes is that this kid is the key. Because only this kid, with his looks and his charisma and his wisdom, can stand in front of the entire nation of Egypt and say, ask not what your country will do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That's Joseph. So Paro immediately says, you've got to do this, right? He should have made him the Secretary of Agriculture. That was what was needed, right? Needed to deal with the grain, somebody to manage the grain. No, we're not making you Secretary of Agriculture. You're in charge. And not only are you in charge, I want you in a convertible driven around the country. This is the next thing that Paro does, right? He dresses him up. He gets a good Egyptian dress, leads him across the country that everybody should be able to see this man and identify with this man and want to be Egyptian because this is the leader. Yeah, this is all in text, right? You just have to be able to see that this is all. So this is a remarkable individual. The question is happening with this guy. How that when he decides, I'm going to be a slave that I can be. It goes further. And it tells us he was so committed to doing whatever it was that he was in at that time to his greatest ability that he names his first child Menashe. And he calls him, and he says, the reason I'm calling him Menashe, says, God has helped me forget my father's household, which is a very interesting name to call your child. Interestingly, even when nobody's paying attention to what he's doing, everything, the power is given into his hands, does he try to get home once? Does he send an email, a postcard, a letter? Would anyone really have found out if he wanted to get it there? No. So this is peculiar about Joseph. We don't know the end of the story. All we see is where he falls into, and every place that he falls into, he rises to the top, becomes extraordinarily successful. So there's something about this man. This is not exclusive, but I suggest this to you. Of course, toss it on your way out if you don't mind the entirety of your prerogative, but I offer this to you. Yosef had one thing that was unique to him, that for most human beings is not a given. To work very, very hard for this. Yosef had a profoundly robust sense of self and identity. And that was not because he was well educated, although he was. And it is not because, he went to a good school, although he probably had good good education. It was not because of that. This is a young man who had absolutely no doubt whatsoever that both of his parents loved him completely and utterly. And that they loved each other. Consider the other boys in that family. As a matter of fact, the entire story up until this point is the fact that you've got a family growing up with 4 different moms, 4 different mothers. It is not completely unapparent that they are vying for position, attention, achievement. Right? And I don't mean that even in a petty way. I mean, they're aiming for very seriously important things. Also very passionate and emotional things. You know, it's the attention of Yaakov. It's the presence of Yaakov. It's the who is going to build the household and all of these things. But one cannot miss those things. Children growing up in that environment are going to pick that up. And so there's always going to be question as to who am I in the scheme of things? And how do I stand in my father's eyes, in my mother's eyes, in both amongst my brethren, and so on. Yosef, in that regard, definitely had clarity. He knew that his father loved him. That was not a question. Everybody knew that his father loved him. And although he didn't have a full amount of time with his mother, he knew that his mother loved him very much. And he knew that they loved each other. So that is something that for many of us, I would go as far as to say most of us, we're not always intact with regards to that. There's always some kind of work that we have to do around that. And that may very well just be part of the human condition. That we have to be able to deal with the questions of love vis-a-vis our parents and our families. Is it unconditional? Is it on condition? Is it there? Is it not there? What does it mean for me to be me in the light of my family? So on and so forth. Right? Yosef has this. And at 17 years old, he has a profoundly robust sense of who he is. And it is quite intact. And I suggest, mind you, that if he were put into the situations in which he found himself and did not have that, the likelihood is he very well would not have survived. What allows for a 17-year-old boy with devilishly good books, and I say devilishly because Chazal say at Gemara, Yosef mechayev et harshaim, which means that Yosef obligates people who have counterproductive thoughts in their minds to keep mitzvot, to keep Torah, even though he didn't have mitzvot like we do, right? But he was a faithful man. He was God-fearing. Why does he obligate them? Because if anybody had a reason to mess around, it was him. Chazal go further. They say when his brothers came to find him in Egypt, the only places that they looked were houses of ill repute because they couldn't imagine he would be anywhere else. So Yosef is 17 years old, very good looking, young, anonymous, in a place where it would be very easy for him to get into trouble. And instead, he recognized the only thing for him to do is to be completely faithful in what it is that he's doing. So consider this. I want you to consider something. I ask you to consider something. In our lives, the nature of our lives is that we have any number of possible lives that we can live. In other words, there is nothing that is stopping any one of us at this time from changing our life, moving somewhere else, doing other things, finding other friends, so on and so forth. That's true. We may upset people who do it. Could be that we might have some financial challenges if we do. But the reality is, bottom line, there is absolutely nothing stopping any one of us from simply changing. Why do I say that to you? Because it means that given a life, there is any number of possibilities of lives that we can live, and we choose one. And it's a sampling, right, of the possible lives. There is only one constant in all of those possibilities. And that is you. You will be the one living whichever life it may be. You will always be there. And that means that if you are the constant, that is the most important thing to focus on. Because the question is not, what am I doing in my life? Really, at the end of the day, it's not very much that. The question is, who is doing it? Because that is what will come out at the end. Who is living the life? Could be many things. But the who is living it, is the real question. And how is the integrity of that individual living that life? How does that manifest? Yosef recognized that at 17 years old. And he recognized, I'm a slave. My only option is to be the best possible slave that I can be. I'm going to do this with my full self. Because not to do that would simply be cheating on his own self. There were no other option. Of course, he could have spent his time trying to get out of it. But that in and of itself, to a certain degree, would have been unfaithful. Opportunities come to him to be able to move in his life, and he does move. But he does not resist where it is that life brings him. He puts all that he has into it because he realizes he's all he's got. And so he doesn't compromise. So another thing Chazal say in Masechet Zvachim, they say his father blessed him at the end of his life, Ben Porat Yosef, Ben Porat Ale Ayin. And they take the word Ayin, which means, right, eye. And they say that eye, the eye of Yosef, never looked at anything that was not his and wanted it. Or never did he take anything that did not squarely belong to him. Of course, we know the famous story of Potiphar's wife. That was a major thing. But that's what Chazal say about it. Yosef had utter clarity on who he was and where the boundaries of self began and ended. He knew what was his and what wasn't. What was his to do and what wasn't. What belonged to him. And that was the greatest gift that his parents gave him. For the majority of us, it takes a good deal of time to come to that clarity. And that clarity, of course, is nothing more than a self of who I am in all that I am. And when that clarity comes to us, and we can talk a bit about what that means, but when that clarity comes to us, things become much clearer as to what it is it's my responsibility to do and what isn't, what is within my boundaries and what is not, what belongs to me and what does not. And my own integrity shines. And what I mean by integrity, the word integrity comes from integrate. And why is that what the word that we use when we talk about faithful behavior? Because if you think about who we are, the nature of our identities as human beings, we are complex. What you feel like in the morning is not necessarily what you feel like in the evening. What you're interested in last week is not necessarily what you're interested in this week. I heard a great podcast recently that said, if you're considering a choice that you're making, put it up for a vote with all the selves that you have going on inside. Because in the morning you might think something, and in the evening you might not feel like it anymore. So put it up for a vote, take a week, you choose, vote, and see who wins out. But that, of course, is true, right, for all of us. Because we say funny things like, I'm not myself today. Well, who are you exactly if you're not yourself today? Well, it's a different aspect of self. you will recognize that there are various aspects of you that you are surprised at, wanting things, interested in things, and so on and so forth. That's just the nature of what it means to be human. Integrity means that all of those various aspects are self-integrated. That we are not living dualistically, pluralistically, that we essentially find alignment in all that we are. I want to say very clearly, it does not mean cutting away parts of ourselves, sequestering parts of ourselves, which is a natural thing that we tend to do when we believe, as we are younger or when we're younger, that there are aspects of ourselves that are unacceptable. I'm not going to get into that deeply, but that's there. Our first order of business before we actually run towards integration is to sequester parts of ourselves. We believe that we can throw parts of ourselves into the dungeon and darken them and not have them manifest. But of course, it never works. They just come back with vengeance. The only way to do this is to be able to integrate. There are many people who write about these ideas. Chazal, one of them. Chazal say beautifully. They say, it says, Chazal pick up, they say, it should say libecha, it says levavecha, which sounds plural, which means there are two hearts in a person. Which is another way of saying two aspects of a person. There are more, but they're generalizing. And they say that's Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Ra, right? There are positive, creative elements in us, and there are negative elements in us that are not. And they say that Bechol Levavecha, loving God with all of your heart, is that even the Yetzer Ra is aimed towards God, which means that it's no longer Ra. But what is that if it's not the Yetzer Tov? It must be something else. So there are elements which we normally recognize as easily being counterproductive that we can bring into productivity if they're channeled appropriately. That is integration. That's integrity. Carl Jung, Lehavdil, from Chazal, he talks about different archetypes that we have, right? Different fundamental characters in terms that make us up. And he talks about individuation, that the goal of our whole life is to individuate, to become full and whole individuals by gathering those elements and integrating those elements. So Yosef is able to be a slave, a prisoner, a viceroy. And he wears the clothes and acts the act and walks the walk as he needs to. But there's one thing that does not change: him. It's always Yosef wearing the hat or the costume or acting the role. But it's him doing it every time. And the way that he's able to do it without failing and losing himself and running into corruption and so on and so forth, the way that he's able to do that is because he's the constant, because he is fully intact. So that was a blessing for him. For the majority of us, it is a life's work. It's why we call him Yosef Tzaddik. He is the righteous one, because he was right the majority of times. And he was able to do this. So he becomes the paradigm. And it's his biography that Torah spends more time on than anyone else. And so when we recognize this about Joseph, we recognize what it is that he's telling his brothers. Because everything that he did with his brothers was for them. It's hard to see that. People don't read the story. I believe people miss this in the story. Yosef is not just taking revenge on his brothers for the sake of taking revenge. He was concerned about his brothers. He was concerned about what was going to happen. If they could sell their brother to certain doom, they needed help. Because there was something about their hearts that was unstable. There was some pain in them so serious that they could inflict that kind of pain on their youngest brother. Something was wrong. And what he believed to be wrong was precisely what he accused them of. He accuses them of what? Merglim. He accuses them of being spies. And that is 100% true as far as he's concerned. What does it mean? What is a spy? A spy is a person who dresses in a certain way to be able to take advantage and exploit wherever it is. That's not faithful. That's not integrity. It may be necessary in political situations every now and then, but the reality is that as a way to live in this world, that the modus operandi, that the way that you engage in this world is to pretend that you are faithful, only to exploit and take from it what you can and what you will. That is not a way to live in this world. And he accuses his brothers of living that way. That they don't integrate. They don't integrate internally and don't integrate externally. And there you have a very important point. The only way to genuinely be able to integrate in this world, which Yosef 100% believes in, right? He doesn't pretend to be the Egyptian viceroy. He is the Egyptian viceroy. He becomes the face of Egypt. He literally becomes the foundation stone upon which the entire country is built. And he does this completely. Not pretend. That's what you call integration. But he doesn't fall apart individually because he's integrated. He integrates himself, which allows for him to integrate externally because he doesn't lose himself in that interaction. He's intact. It is only when we are not intact, when we do not have that level of integration or integrity, as we would say, that we really have problems with being able to integrate with what's outside of us. Because we don't just share, we dissipate. Or we take things and fill the emptiness, the places that are not whole, that really don't belong inside. Saw a great thing the other day, an image, one of these memes, it was like a head of garlic. And in one of the slots of the head of garlic, was a tangerine section, wedge, yeah. And it said, not every place you fit in is where you belong. What a great thing that is. Not every place we fit in is where we belong. Belonging is very different than fitting in. And most of us long to fit in. But belonging is very much about identity. Who am I? Where do I belong? It's a very different question than, can I fit in? And as far as Yosef was concerned, he knew where he belonged. He belonged on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol with the rest of his brothers. Chazal say that is what he saw when he was led with the wife of Potiphar. They say he saw an image. They saw that his name was missing on the breastplate. And he realized that he was compromising his entire self with this one act. His brothers needed to learn this. That's why he says, you're spies. And until you can show me, he says to them, that you care about your brother and your father, I don't believe you. Show me. And he gets them into a situation where they have to fight for Binyamin. Dedicate themselves honestly and truly to the well-being of their own brother. And that's precisely what they do. That's their whole ordeal. That's all it is. All it is, can you show that what you did to me is something that you can change about yourself and overcome? And Yehuda does it. That's the amazing thing. Yehuda, his brother, who said, let's sell him, ends up saying to his father, Dad, I need you to send Ben with me. I need you to do it. And I'm telling you, I will give my life. I am going to give myself to protect this boy. And guess what? He actually has to do it. If push comes to shove, and he actually has to do this. And Binyamin is framed by Yosef, of course. And Yehuda has to stand up and say, listen, pal, I mean, that is a 180-degree turn. And Yosef is so moved by it that he cries and he can't hold it anymore. He should for another year. He doesn't hold it. Because Yehuda genuinely shifted into real care and real integrity and real integration and commitment right before his eyes. It actually worked. Incidentally, so serious and so real and fundamental and powerful was the commitment of Yehuda to Binyamin that to this day, they have never left each other. To this day, if you are a biological Jew, you descend either from the tribe of Yehuda or Binyamin or Levi. They're the only ones left. They stuck together throughout all time. From that one episode. So when we look at all of this, and we see this biographical arc of this very remarkable individual, progenitor of this nation, one of the progenitors of this nation, we recognize that, number one, it is very important to integrate into the world that we find ourselves. The only way to really and truly do that is to integrate ourselves and find genuine integrity, wholeness, and clarity of identity. It's the only way we can do it. Important things that you and I will ever do is to pay attention to, care for, cultivate, and integrate ourselves. We get ourselves out of that by convincing ourselves selfish, arrogant, and so on. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because here's something that we need to remember. You are the only one who can live your life. No one else can do that. Everything else, somebody else can do. Otherwise, you're entirely replaceable. They may do it differently, they may do it a little poorly, a little better, but there is only one thing that only you and no one else can do, and that is to be everything that you can be in your life. The first word that God speaks in the Torah, the first word that he speaks in the Torah is Yehi. And that word means be. And that is all really that needs to be said. Everything else is just addition onto that. But that is the tenor of the entirety of creation. It is the call to everything and all that's in it, to every one of us. Be. It's the one thing that you and I are tasked to do. And that means it isn't selfish or arrogant. Who is it that said, arrogance is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Right? That's the difference. That's humility, really. It's the opposite way. You don't think less of yourself. You just think of yourself appropriately, that's all. And what is it that I need to do in order to be able to be the best individual that I can be? Why? Because that's all I've got. I will be a better giver when I am that way. I will serve better, love better, give better, be better, share better when I am whole and full. It is the one central thing that we do in our lives. And it's never too late. And it is a lifetime of work. So there's one thing that I always recognize is important. Yeah. Yosef has kids. Ephraim and Menashe. And with this we'll close, and if anyone has questions. So there are also miracles, Ephraim and Menashe. They grow up in Egypt. Again, no Chabad. They've just got their dad and their mom, and they are, for all intents and purposes, high-ranking Egyptian officials. far as Chazal tells. At the very least, they certainly are growing up there. They're dressing like an Egyptian, talking like an Egyptian, walking like an Egyptian. And their grandfather comes down to Egypt, Yaakov. And he says, these boys, wow. Ephraim and Menashe, Reuven and Shimon. Your boys, Ephraim and Menashe, they're going to be like Reuven and Shimon. But he says, before he says, these boys, ad boi elecha. These boys that you raised before I came to you, meaning I wasn't there, my influence wasn't there. This is you, Joseph. This is all you. You've raised these boys in a foreign land, in foreign environment, foreign place. Everything is not us. And yet, they are completely us. The externals may not look it, but internally, through and through, they are created completely whole members of Israel. They will become tribes. What we do, we bless our kids to be like them. Every Shabbat. Yesimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim chimnashe. May God make you like Ephraim and Menashe. And what are we blessing them to be? Precisely that. Be so whole in yourself. Be so clear in your identity. Be so integrated and faithful that no matter where you are, no matter what you do, where you go, you will be fully you and remain intact. That's the blessing of this incredible Ephraim and Menashe. And so that's what we're reading now. I believe it is one of the reasons anyway why it is the longest biographical narrative in the Torah. Because it's the fundamental lesson for every single one of us. It is how we are meant to live our lives. And we lose sight of it sometimes. But it is important always to come back to that and to do the best that we can to so if there's any questions on it, I'm happy to answer them. Yes. Yes. No, to you. Yeah.
I can wait 4 questions.
One question.
Well, maybe that would be manipulation for you to read that. So
please, God.
Okay. How does that story that Joseph asks his cellmate to kind of vouch for him?
To vouch for him. Yeah. So that's the one area. That is the one place where Chazal say that Yosef missed a beat. Right? In which he believed that somebody else could do something he needed to be able to hold it there. So that's the one area. And that was a lesson for him. But, for a person like Yosef, for most of us, that wouldn't be a thing, right? We would just do everything that we can to try and get out of the thing. But given him and the pattern of his life and how it was that he was living, this was a challenge. Because jail was horrendous. And so he skipped the thing there. But that's how Chazal sees it. Yes, Rabbi.
Can you give us a suggestion, a step to take to integrate?
Yes, I can, but that doesn't mean that's going to be any easier work. But I can. I'll give you 2. I'll give you 3. Okay? The first one that I will say is genuinely, it is important. I believe that it's valuable to think about ourselves in terms of parts. We're not very often comfortable about doing that because we think it means that we are kind of, multiple personalities or something. But who are we kidding? We are. Right? We just pretend. Very as parts. And I'll suggest reading on this if you want, right? That is more popular and contemporary. You don't have to read Jung, right? It's much more difficult to read. But one of the best modern presentations of this idea that I have found is by a man named Richard Schwartz, Dr. Richard Schwartz. And he's a psychologist and a therapist. And he recognized that when he was dealing with individual patients, that the constellation of family and dynamics were manifesting within the individual. And so he started to use family therapy with the individual with those particular dynamics. And so he developed a type of therapy called internal family systems therapy, IFS for short. So first of all, Google Richard Schwartz, Google IFS, and you'll see that. But he wrote a book called No Bad Parts. I highly suggest reading that. And what that essentially looks at is that if we are honest, there are these elements of, so there are critical, so on and so forth. But if we start to think of ourselves as these parts, we start to allow ourselves to recognize, well, what are the various parts that run in me? When I feel different in the morning to the evening or last week, they come up more than once. They come up often. What are the elements in self that keep coming up? And what are the elements, and this is the key, if we're brave enough, and this is the harder part, what are the elements of self that I am very uncomfortable with? That in my conscious mind, I am not happy manifest, which I sequester, or that I keep secret, or that I don't look at. And I'll be honest, for some of us, we have sequestered parts for so long and so severely that we don't even have them in consciousness. They manifest only in unconscious. So the first thing I would say is start to allow yourself to think of yourself in terms of parts. And I think that there's source in Chazal. Like I said, I think that B'chol Levavecha is beautiful. What does it mean, B'chol Levavecha Yetzer Tov should be Oved HaKadosh? What is that? Obviously, that's talking about integration, very broad terms. So that's number one. And I would read that, right? That's number one. Number two, consider how it is that you talk to yourself in here. Because this has everything to do with how it is that we treat ourselves. And if I have a high level of critic internally, right, if that is the dominant voice in my mind, I will not allow myself to integrate and find faithfulness because I'll be too busy killing myself over what it is that I do. And then because I feel bad about myself, I misbehave. That's the cycle. And then I hate myself for misbehaving. And then I criticize myself for doing it. And then I misbehave. So that's part of integrating the Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Ra, right? The Yetzer Tov, one of the ways of integrating Yetzer Tov is not to give yourself carte blanche to do what you want. It's to be able to tell yourself to listen, recognize. So how does one do this? A tactic that I like to suggest is consider that you were taking care of someone younger than you. And the reason I say that is because these elements that we struggle with, they happen very early on in life. Very early. So there are child parts of self, right? There's Na'ar, right? Yosef, by the way, he's defined as a Na'ar. Who Na'ar? That's how the Torah defines him, not just because he's 17 years old at the time. This is who he is. So there are young parts of ourselves. But the reason why I say that is because it's easier for us to consider care for a younger person that needs our help, guidance, support. So imagine that you were taking care, that you had in your trust a younger person. And then ask yourself the following questions. Would you feed that person what you eat if they were in your care and their health was your responsibility? Would that person sleep under your watch the way that you sleep? Would you let that person scroll aimlessly at 11 o'clock at night in bed, until you doze off and can't keep your eyes open anymore, like I do, right? Would somebody do that? Would you do that with them? And finally, and most importantly, would you speak to that person the way that you speak to you in here? Would you use the language, the tone of voice? And if you would that not be abuse? Would it be the right way? So that's the second thing that I would say. Consider the internal voice and behavior. And if you're questioning it and want an external reference, would you do what you're doing to you to somebody who is younger in your care? And if you wouldn't, stop doing it to you. It's easy to say, not easy to do, but I suggest it anyway. And finally, and this is a harder one, and you might think this is a little weird, and you'll find it to be weird if you actually have the guts to do it. When we look in the mirror, we very rarely, if ever, look at our eyes. We look at the wrinkles. We look at the, whatever it is that we might be looking at, our hair, whatever we've got left, whatever it is. That's what we look at. We very rarely, if ever, find our eyes in the mirror. And actually, it's quite unnerving to look yourself in the eye. But I would suggest you do it. I would suggest you start it for 5 minutes. Put a timer on your phone. It will be highly uncomfortable. But I ask you to consider, how do you feel about that person that's looking back at you in the mirror? Do you love that person? Do you welcome that person? Do you recognize that that person might have flaws, but that he is nonetheless or she loved? Try that. These are real avodah, right? Real avodah that a person can do. That is a mitzvah. To be able to be mekayem, v'hafta l'ra'acha kamocha, because remember, v'hafta l'ra'acha is always and only kamocha. And everybody thinks, well, the kamocha parts, that's easy. How am I supposed to love anybody as much as I love myself? Well, my question is, do you actually really love yourself? And that goes back to all of those questions. And that's part of the inyan. So I hope that, yes.
One of Rabbi Sachs' books, he sees the story of Joseph as a culmination of the naval issues and Ishmael and Yitzhak and Yaakov and Isaac. He sees this as the culmination of the progression. Do you see it that way?
I can't speak on behalf of Rabbi Sachs. That's all. I think that the reading of it, that if you look at it from that perspective, I can certainly see how it is that he sees this as a culmination, right? Because he talks about the development of family, right? The progression of family. I recognize that as very significant because whenever it is we're talking about myself, I'm always talking about myself in terms of family because Torah certainly recognizes elements as being generated or carry over from generation to generation. So within that context, where things are being worked out across generations, yes, I do see that. I'm looking at it more on the individual. And one would question, can you ever look at it on the individual without looking at it? Well, no, but that means that one needs to be able to look at oneself, perhaps in terms of what it is that happened in his family, her family, previously, and so on. But at the end of the day, like I said, the responsibility of your life lies squarely with you and nobody else. And that's what the perspective that I'm taking. So I don't necessarily disagree with Rabbi Sachs. I'm simply looking at it in a more kind of behavioral way, if that makes sense. Yeah. Maybe one more, if there is. Yeah.
You said that Joseph doesn't know the end of the story.
I'm saying we are not supposed to. He doesn't know the end of the story. Correct. Yeah.
He's going through all these.
Yeah.
Didn't he have some kind of prophet kind of that he could see? No.
Not that we know of. Not that we know of. No indication as such. He had faith. He had hope. Hope, which is very important, but not prophecy. Yeah, not as far as. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Rabbi Dweck.